we're getting plunged into a bureaucratic meeting called the First Regional Forum on the Rights of the Amazon. And then we're talking to lawyers, and laws, and all these acronyms, and we're in Colombia of all places, speaking Spanish. Ah, it's harsh, man. Rough stuff. Well, he said it was densely loaded terms. Yeah. I mean, everybody likes to be out with the cows and the leopards, talking about deities and gurus and getting possessed by spirits and stuff. That's all cool. But the truth of the matter is, most people today in all parts of the world spend their lives in places like this. Classrooms, bureaucratic meetings, and going to lawyers, and so drab. Is there any crossover ethnographically between these two chapters? Oh, come on. Let's see. Here's I looked up the place where they had this meeting in the Putumayo. That's a nice place. That seems like a good place to be. I mean, it seems nicer than our windowless classroom. You got your open windows onto the place, you got your things. And I started thinking about the things you guys were worried about when we were talking about the humid tropics. The mosquitoes. How do they keep the mosquitoes out, we ask? Oh no.
Citronella.
Remember what Moran said? He said, you can either try to keep the heat out and close it all in, or let it be all open. You can't solve this problem. Look at that. They can't solve it. There you go. Right there in the humid tropics. Anyway, there they are having their bureaucratic meeting. The thing that I thought was a nice overlap, I guess I get leopards and jaguars confused. Here we're talking about jaguars. In the last chapter, we're talking about leopards. Leopards eating cattle. Here, they're convinced, they're angry at this corpo amazonia. They're the ones that are holding the meeting because they were convinced that these government bureaucrats were dropping jaguars out of helicopters with GPS trackers. And when they shot them because they'd eat their cattle, then they put them in jail. So probably not happening, but you know, you can see why people would be suspicious of such activities if you lived in this area of the world. So there you go. There's some ethnographic crossover. The jaguars, I mean, they're not leopards, but they both eat cattle. Big cats, yeah. Actually, now I'm starting to wonder what the difference is.
So they're kind of conspiracy theorists about the GPS jaguars.
They are. That would exactly be what they are. Yeah, they're convinced that
They did their own research.
They have life experience on this. So, thinking about how big the Amazon is, and I found this on Reddit, a comparison between the Amazon basin and the United States. Whoa, right? Whoa. It's on Reddit, but it is true. I looked it up. I did my own research independently. The official boundary of the Amazon basin would be about 87% of the continental US. So it's pretty close in terms of its size.
It's like 1.5 Texas.
Huh?
It's like a joke. It's like how they compare like Texas to everyone.
Well, I mean, if you include Alaska in here, it gets different. But I'm just saying, most of us know about the United States and where we are, this down part. And most of us don't know about Texas, Mickey.
Does that include the deforested parts?
I mean, obviously, it depends exactly where you're going to draw the lines here. I mean, it's an interesting question. if you can read Portuguese, this is actually from in Portuguese, and it's titled, "So the Gringos Can Understand Better." So, I mean, for one thing, it's kind of interesting that the Brazilians call the people in the United States gringos, because that's usually something that I think usually the Mexicans invented to call us, but it's kind of become this blanket term that's used throughout Latin America to describe people that are from outside, including Europeans and anybody that is traveling through. So they say that this is so the gringos can understand, so the people in the United States can understand better how big the Amazon is. Because there are some people in Brazil, and I'm not going to advocate for this position, but I'm just going to give it to you, what they would say. If we say, we got to protect the Amazon, they would say, what are you talking about? You guys, I'm going to get out my pen here. You guys deforested all this land through here, just ripped it down. Massachusetts, there was Liam's ancestors, just ripping that forest down, as we know, ripping down Michigan. And now you guys have this Colorado River and you're using all the water in the West. Don't tell us what to do. You blew your whole continent to shreds. We'll do what we want with ours. Again, I'm not saying this is a good idea. I'm just saying, you know.
What do we know?
What do we know? Here we are. We already destroyed the whole continent that's just bigger than the Amazon basin. Now, anyway, like I said, not really. We shouldn't really do that. And we shouldn't have done that in the first place, and we should work to restore it. But I'm just saying that's what they would tell you. Anyway. Here's actually a map without the United States superimposed, which it really doesn't fit on there exactly right. So, yeah, I mean, Mickey, you're right. There's various kind of forms of forest and lowlands going on here and a patchwork of stuff happening. Most of the time when we think about the Amazon, we think about, of course, Brazil, which has most of the Amazon in it. But a bunch of countries have an interest in it. Bolivia has a pretty large chunk of the Amazon, and Peru has a pretty large chunk, and Ecuador has a little bit, used to have more until Peru took it away. And Colombia, which we'll be reading about, has a pretty large expanse here. Venezuela has some. Guyana, what was formerly known as, I think, British Guyana, settled or colonized by the Brits at one point. Suriname, which I think once known as Dutch Guyana, colonized by the Dutch, and they actually speak some Dutch there. And French Guyana, which is still, I told you, I think, is still a part of France, uses the euro and votes in French elections. So that's the one, actually it's the only remaining, it's the only place in South America that is not an independent country. So it's a pretty wide, again, we usually think about Brazil, but it's an amazing place, which is even bigger than Brazil. What else do we think about, Zeke, when we think about the Amazon? What do we get sad about the Amazon? Deforestation. Yes, we may have heard about this. Deforestation in the Amazon. They're kind of almost linked together in our minds. Here we turn to Colombia, where they have, like we said, a portion of the Amazon and deforestation. What happens there, Zeke? They bring a lawsuit, right?
Agriculture and rural development in the 40s, cities of the Colombian Amazon. The lines onto we like obligating them to follow like Paris Agreement so that we reach like net zero
Wait a second. So they brought a lawsuit. Who'd you say it's against? The president?
Yeah, it's against all these like companies and organizations.
Oh my gosh, that is a big lawsuit. Right, yeah, sounds pretty quixotic, bringing a lawsuit like that. Sounds like trouble. Yeah, the lawsuits claim that, that Colombia had signed into the Paris Accord and didn't just leave it for fun. They actually still were in it. No. Yeah, I guess we're back in the Paris Accord. We left it for a while. We're back. So they had done this, and they also had national agreements within. And so the lawsuit says it's not abiding by these agreements. And this kind of, in Colombia, at least in some senses, they would often kind of go on the international scene and sign treaties and declarations of human rights or child rights or things like that. And then you'd go back into Colombia, and there'd be very little following of the agreements or the treaties that they had signed. So they're very good on the international scene at signing treaties. Sometimes at home, it didn't always work. So big lawsuit. What happens, Zeke? You can't win a lawsuit like this, can you?
If they wanted to follow domestic laws to reduce the enemy, like they were trying to follow back from their 1853 laws. Go to
Well, it's kind of a surprise to us because when we go sue the president and have a lawsuit and say that we need environmental rights, we don't expect to actually win. We would never win that, but they win the freaking lawsuit, man. They actually win this thing. And not only did they win, the people that are bringing the lawsuit won, then the whole Amazon gets rights in this thing. He just threw that in there, giving rights to the Amazon. That was like, you're amazing. Crazy. They actually won it. This guy, Judge Tolosa. Good looking guy, right? There he is.
like a high.
Yeah. This guy is like a hero to some environmental types. He's like an international person. And he says, this was in the book, a judge today has to be avant-garde. Got to be on the cutting edge of things. Got to get out there and defend the environment. Well, that's a breath of fresh air, huh? I'd like some judges to be on the avant-garde. We got a few judges around. They do weird things in this country.
They're kind of avant-garde and not the way we want.
They're avant-garde and, the ethical rules and accepting gifts from billionaires. That's avant-garde. But, a judge today has to be avant-garde. Not what you usually hear, right, Anna? No. And in fact, this whole ruling is justified based on what? Biocultural rights and the rights of indigenous peoples in their land, the ancestral practices of local communities, perceptions of their life worlds, and respect for reciprocal relations with nature that provide for their daily sustenance. This is beautiful, man. I typed this quote into PowerPoint. No, I copied it off of Anna's comment, typed it into PowerPoint, and then PowerPoint told me to come out with this beautiful hand reaching out. The sun is coming up. I mean, this is awesome, right? This is not what you usually hear. We got a judge fighting for the environment out there. The win, it's win-win. Everything's great so far. Yeah. This is part of something that people are starting to do all over the world. I think they're starting to call it Earth jurisprudence. Right, Liz? Who's getting rights here? Yeah, this is happening in lots of different places, and people are kind of taking these things and running with them, and all kinds of natural beings are getting these great rights, like the oso de anteojos. The spectacled bear now has some rights. You can't deny rights to that guy. It's the International Day of the Spectacled Bear, the guardian of the Paramos, the guardian of the highlands of Colombia. So it's spectacled bear got rights, the oso de anteojos. She also mentions the paramos are actually a part of highland Colombia. That's one of the parks that they have, with also has been given some rights, parques nacionales. This is again the highland of Colombia, or this place.
Wow.
Yeah, Los Nevados National Park in the high Andes, which all seems awesome. This is a story of triumph and definitely makes me want to go back to Colombia. Beautiful place. There's Colombia. So Colombia is in South America, kind of at the top northwest corner. Here's our Amazonian region to the west. Yeah, and that's the province of Amazonas down there, which would be our, that would be what she describes as the far eastern Amazonas, the closest to Brazil. This is where the Andean mountain chain kind of splits into three sections, coming up from Ecuador and Peru here. So the capital of Colombia is Bogota, and that's where Tolosa is, and the judge and the magistrates, the Supreme Court, and the laws are coming from. And as she says, Colombia is often seen as a very Andean-centric country. That is, the people that live in the mountains in the Andes see themselves as the civilized part of the place, and see this other area, the Amazon or the coast, as kind of the backwards, uncivilized place. So if you live in the mountains up where the major cities are, Bogota, Medellin, which you may know from the drug trade, and Cali, which would also be kind of one of the cities there. So the people who live in the mountains and in the cities consider themselves to be civilized in relationship to. So this down here is the Putumayo. That's where the conference was held, and that's where a lot of Lyons's research is coming out of. It's kind of, like I said, I wanted to go back to Colombia. My own research was over here in Túquerres, Nariño, which is pretty close to the Putumayo, but it's a little town up in the Andes. So it's in the mountains at about 10,000 feet of altitude. And you know, even the people there, so the people there were these that I was talking to mostly saw themselves as kind of small scale farmers in the mountains. And it was interesting because in relationship to Bogota and in relationship to the urban elites, they saw themselves as completely kind of out of it and marginalized and not having anything to do with what was going on. And they knew that they were kind of disadvantaged. They were what Lyons refers to, or they would refer to themselves sometimes as campesinos, as small-scale farmers or peasants. But it was true that their idea of things was, you know, when I talked to them, they'd be like, some of them would be like, yeah, those people in the Amazon, they're even more backwards than us. They're even worse off than we are. They're still hunting out there. And, you know, so they had this idea that even though they were marginalized, there were even more further marginalized people out here somewhere. So this is a stratified country in ways similar to what Hernandez talks about in terms of the relationships between being indigenous and being Latino or mestizo in these countries. Definitely applies here. So again, I guess I would say that after all this beauty, it really wasn't quite so beautiful, because for the people in the Putumayo, of course, and the people of the Amazon, this ruling, this court order, this judge who was being all avant-garde was seen as a kind of a top-down ruling. Autumn, what would you say? Did it really intertwine the indigenous practices into its ruling?
They tried to think like they thought they were, but even if they didn't give any credit where that knowledge came from.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lyons is arguing that it doesn't really consider what's going on. It's not coming actually from the bottom up, that there are indigenous forms of jurisprudence and there are ideas coming from there, but this ruling was kind of an abstract, idealized version from the top of what should be happening. And it's basically, like I said, coming from the capital of Bogota, which is up in the Andes Mountains, which is seen as the center of power in Colombia, and then being imposed upon the lowland forest periphery. To the extent that people in this area, Jacob, would see this as conservation what kind of conservation is it? Militaristic conservation. So she calls it the militarized conservation or the militarization of conservation. Conservation at the point of a gun, right? You can't do this. Now, we've seen this a little bit before. I mean, it's a little bit perhaps more extreme than what some of the things that Hernandez was talking about, but anytime you're trying to kick people out of a place or trying to enforce laws as your way of conserving things, you're probably going to run into trouble, especially in this area. Why, Tyler? What's going on in this area of the Amazon?
There's the displacement of the indigenous peoples, and then there's the settler zones that were created.
Yeah, and then there's this other thing. What's the United States doing down there? The war on drugs. Yeah, this is I mean, in our own country, we have experienced the war on drugs in different ways, usually as a war on poor and minoritized communities in our own country. But the people that live in other countries, especially in Colombia, experience it in another way, which is helicopters spraying and planes spraying down crops and trying to fumigate and eradicate farms and coca from above. And so the United States has supplied Colombia with many, many, many dollars in order to fight this war on drugs. It didn't work. Surprise, surprise. And it just, I guess I would say that almost every weekend that I would, and the place where I was did not produce any drugs, they produced potatoes. But every weekend, you know, if you're going out to talk to people or going to, and, you know, have a drink or two, and they'd be like, why does the United States send money for the war on drugs? You're the ones that are buying the thing. Solve your own problems first. Don't try to get rid of the supply here. Hopefully, we're entering a new period, but boy, it was kind of like what Hernandez was talking about with Central America, the things that were done with US money in Colombia to fight drugs. Oh boy. Also in this zone, somewhat ironically, Tori, you talked about this a little bit. What's going on in this zone that might be strange, paradoxical?
It's like the areas where the government wasn't involved were all the areas where like there was not deforestation happening. So it's like all the untouched areas like kept doing well because there was no government intervention or anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a strange situation. This was a place where it was one of the last holdouts of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarios de Colombia, the FARC, a guerrilla movement that had gone on for, it was one of the longest lasting guerrilla movements that said to be committed to social justice, but people suspected they were more involved in drug dealing and other things. Anyway, because there was so much conflict in this area, it is kind of paradoxical that there were some places where it was so conflicted that you couldn't really do anything like logging and the kinds of things that people like to do in the forest. And so some of these areas were preserved, in fact, or maybe because of the guerrilla warfare that was going on and the government wasn't there. So we end up with this commitment that Colombia makes to zero deforestation, but it's ignoring the fact that people need to make a living, that they don't give any funds for the kinds of things that people need to do. And so there they are. Cass, they do give out loans to some people, though.
They develop loans. Deforestation, so the money is kind of working against the conservation effort.
Yeah, so the local people are kind of a little bit pissed off about this because they're not supporting local projects, but they will support you if you want to do a big cattle ranch or something like that. And they're especially mad because they'll really support you if you go in and drill for oil. So even the oil executives themselves say, yeah, this peace deal with the FARC is great. We're going to go in there and start drilling away. And yeah, so I guess this might make somebody mad. And it is an interesting confluence or congruence between some of these big oil companies and things like wildlife federations. They seem to be paying each other off in order to say that they're conserving things while drilling the Amazon. Now, when we come back to the Judge Tolosa, he says, at least according to Lyons, he said that he really didn't know much about that part of the Amazon, hadn't really been there, and that he had not considered how the ruling might criminalize the same rural sectors long stigmatized, persecuted, and structurally excluded. In fact, I don't know, John, do you remember what Tolosa says about this issue? Nah, he says that these are issues for public policy. So I'm writing the law here. I'm doing the official law. This is an issue for public policy. Now, Lyons says, our author, he says, well, I don't want to criticize this particular guy and this particular magistrate, and maybe he has a good heart, but Mickey, what does he need to do, or what should the law do? Not just this guy.
It was like, the law should be, it should be applied to the law and the law applied.
Yeah, that the law shouldn't just be this thing out in the abstract, that it shouldn't just be above and denying the complex realities. So Lyons says, just because you're a judge ruling over things, you can't deny these complex realities. She says that judges should know something about the history of the place that they're ruling over. They should know about that. And as a minimum, they should do an in situ visit, which I interpret as go there once, maybe, before you make a ruling about a whole kind of territory. So this is something that one of the recommendations that Lyons is making in this is that if you are a judge making a ruling about a place, that you might want to go there, learn a little about the history, talk to people, things that you probably want anthropologists to do, but judges have to do it too if they're going to rule on these complex issues. And in fact, Anaya, maybe they shouldn't just go there once, but what else might they do? Maybe listen to the people who are there. Maybe they should consult with the people who are there. And as she says, as Lyons says, do the people, is it really going to help to extend a rights-based framework into the area? And, you know, in some cases, maybe. But in some cases, this might have weird consequences. And so at least she thinks that in this case, if you just talk about rights, it has these weird criminalizing consequences for behaviors and livelihoods that you might, they might not have wanted to have in the first place, and this might not be the best solution to that particular case. And so I think, Cass, you drew our attention to the very end. Why?
It's her perspective, but it resembles the perspective that Hernandez takes, which is listen to the voices of Indigenous people in the area and follow their approach to things. They've been living there for longer, they know how to use the land more effectively.
Yeah, so listen to the inhabitants who have not only survived, but who continue to endure and flourish. Yeah, I agree. This is a lesson that is a good refresher from Hernandez. So that's good. There's a couple of other interesting points. At the very beginning, she talks about how she's going to, at the end, talk about something called bettering conflict on page 57. Tyler mentioned this, but he fled the classroom. So, what do you think bettering conflict means? Bettering conflict. That sounds weird. Mickey. Conflict for a better reason. Liam. Less destructive conflict, bettering conflict. Yeah, it's a strange phrase. He later describes it as creating opportunities to confront and live out disagreements. So the way I guess I would say this is, if conflict arises, let us say we come into conflict, that instead of, well, let me give you her words for it. Bettering conflict implies reorienting the expectation of resolving conflicts or merely experiencing them as dissensions that must be forcibly quelled through repressive strategies. So basically, I don't like conflict. And if I experience conflict, I want to either quash it and, or resolve it. I want it to go away. I don't like conflict. But she's saying, hey, maybe we need to just let it play out a little bit, live with it in order to not result in a militarized situation. This might be good advice for, seems like good advice for family situations sometimes, you know? Yeah, I think that's good, like parenting advice or sibling advice, maybe. Just create an opportunity to confront and live out your disagreements instead of trying to resolve all the problems on the spot. I don't know if you've had parental figures who try to solve all your problems before you're ready for it, but sometimes those people can be annoying. I know, because I do it. And then I get in trouble. I want you to solve my problems, just want you to listen. Anyway, saying. There's something, another part of this that was striking to me, perhaps it may have escaped your notice, was her comments on Colombia's Constitution of 1991, which was a super interesting document. It, like other parts of Colombian legislation, it was very progressive. It gave a lot of autonomy to various territorial regions, and much of the lawsuits and other things that have been won are based on the rights that were provided in this constitution. It's a far more progressive constitution than was originally in place, and is seen as kind of a model for other countries. Like I said, it's not always followed, but it was an interesting effort. And Lyons makes the comment that in this constitution, there was a lot of language that was meant to try and promote and aspire, and as she puts it, guarantee the cultural integrity of Indigenous and Afro-descendant groups. And so again, this was seen as in a country like Colombia, which was a very oppressive towards its Indigenous and Afro-descendant groups for many, many years. this was kind of a turn of events and seen as a watershed and a time in which the state would start to do something, the government started to do something very different. But she then goes on to say that these special protections have not been extended to campesino communities, even though they share similar experiences of social exclusion and histories of agrarian-based violence. And so one of the things about this Constitution is that it elevated, or it aspired to elevate the identities and the rights of Indigenous and Afro-descendant groups. But when it came to people who were in the same place and maybe had some of the same customs and same experiences, but didn't label themselves as Indigenous or Afro-descendant, they didn't really get the same protections. And she's not saying that they should get the same protections, but she's saying that that should be recognized. And this is something that came up again in my work when I was a youngster. I might have got a footnote in here when I talked about how, in some ways, because the Colombian state made itself a neutral party and said, we're just neutral, we're just going to promote the rights of everybody. What it did was it sort of retreated from the social sphere, and I argued kind of made the racism that was out there in civil society, it kind of allowed it to flourish, because people would get mad at Indigenous people, Afro-descendant people, for having these new rights, and it created in some ways, or exacerbated, existing social conflict. So it's just something to think about when you were talking about negotiating with all the inhabitants of the area. So it's something she says too toward the end, what proposals to mitigate deforestation would emerge if Indigenous communities, cattle ranchers, representatives of oil companies, loggers, and cocaleros, people who plant coca, were invited to the table. So it's kind of a radical proposition. Not everyone wants to have all these people at the table. But she's, I think, trying to say that what would happen if you talk to all the inhabitants of a given area. And as we learned from Hernandez, the politics of Indigenous representation and identity are different in much of Latin America than they are in the United States and Canada. So as Hernandez was talking about, in the United States and Canada, there are more often treaty rights and land rights that there's already zones that are supposed to be autonomous. We learned about this a little bit when Abraham Francis zoomed in to talk to us about the nationhood, the Mohawk Nation, right? So that's a place that is supposed to be protected by an autonomous treaty rights. In many places in Latin America, it isn't. It's quite a bit more complicated, and there isn't like sort of reserves or indigenous zones. And so what she's saying is all these people are inhabitants, and in some ways often sharing similar life ways. So what would happen if we brought in the indigenous communities, the cattle ranchers, oil company reps, loggers? I mean, some people are logging, small scale loggers, people who plant coca. So that would be interesting. The next sentence was, the next part of that sentence was also super interesting. In the co-presence, along with jaguars, re-emerging secondary forests. Oh yeah, that's that Sweden agriculture we were talking about, where you cut down stuff and you burn it, and then it comes back up as forest, and then it's like, whoa, new forest. Cattle, coca plants, and ancestral spirits who are also coming to the meeting and sitting at the table with us. The jaguars. Yeah, I wanted to. No, real jaguars and ancestral spirit jaguars. I wanted to plug this into one of those those AI image generators and see if I could bring all these people to the table along with some jaguars and some coca plants and ancestral spirits. For those of you who didn't believe there was any connection between these two, we got some ancestral spirits, some coca plants, cattle, jaguars, secondary forests. If you go to YouTube, you can see her whole talk on nature and territories as victims in Colombia's transition. Pretty interesting.